It's talking about the temple. Oh, yeah. This is what happened. Oh, yeah.
Hey, Mr. Zombie Man, do you want to play some badminton?
No, thank you. Not right now. Thank you, though. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Mr. Zombie Man, this isn't working. I don't think they can understand you. Yeah.
Hey, y'all. That was interesting. I just passed, anyway, whatever. Never know what goes on in this house. Well, it's good to see you. I'm sorry I've been away for so long. I hope that the teachers that I provided were adequate. I know they probably weren't as exciting or interesting as Pastor Mark, but I'm back, and I'm glad to be back. And I do miss you guys, and I miss us, the great discussions that we have in class. Joyce always bringing some good questions and making things interesting, and really all of you being thoughtful. And yeah, I mean, maybe hopefully soon I will see you, the 8th graders, at some point, I hope. But I'm praying for you guys, and definitely 7th graders, I'll see you next year. But for now, we need to talk about our last section from the book of the Old Testament, and we are on T, so casket, T. Anybody know what T stands for? Yes, Micah? Temple, very good. So we've covered K, kings, E, exile, and now we're on T. E, empty, that word right there, that comes next year for the New Testament. All right, so we're going to cover T, temple, and you guys need to keep working on your timeline, okay? That's due coming up. I think we're going to say it's due at the the second Monday in May. Second Monday in May. So that should give you plenty of time. I can't wait to see what you come up with. I can't wait to see it. Get it to me. We'll figure out how to do that later. But so T, temple. It's temple, and it's really the second temple because the first temple was destroyed, and it covers the time period between. So put this in your notes. Make sure you pull this up. I sent it to you. If you don't have it, pause right there. Go get it. Print it off. And it covers the dates 539 to 430. Okay, 539 to 430 BC. Now, don't forget, it's tricky because everything BC, okay, before Christ, before Common Era, however you want to say it, everything before then counts down, right? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then we restart AD, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 2020. So, yeah, we're counting down, and now we're at 539 to 430. And I want us to really focus on 5 characters. So we're going to talk about 5 characters 5 people that lived and existed, and the particular challenges they faced and how they dealt with it. Okay, so 5 people, 5 important people during this time period, and how they dealt with it. 4 of them are on your sheet. I'm going to add one more, and you can take notes on these people. Okay, take notes, and we'll get back to them. So the first person is Job. Okay, right there at the top, Job. And I put question marks beside that because it's a little unknown exactly what time period Job fits into. So Job, we're just going to pop him in here. I think this is a good place, good estimate of where he probably fit into, but we really don't know for sure. But we do need to talk about him because he's a significant person. So Job, and then we're going to talk about Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and then a little bit on Cyrus. Okay, so add Cyrus down here. So I don't know what this is. Maybe Saul came in here at some point. Okay, so Job. Most of you, many of you will know the story of Job. Job was a godly man. He was a man who served God. He was wealthy. He lived righteously. And what the Bible tells us in the book of Proverbs, that if you live righteously, if you live in the way that God has called you, that you will benefit from that. That you will flourish, you will do well. Does that mean you all won't have hardships? No, of course not. You will have hardships because that's life. We live in a broken world. But you will, but in general, default, if you live rightly, then you'll benefit from that. And Job was one of those guys. Job did as God expected, and he looked to God, and he had many children and many, and a good wife and a rich farm. And an interesting thing happened is that Satan came to God and said, Job, of course he follows you because look at what he has. I mean, it's easy for him to follow you. It's easy for him to do what is right because he's got everything he needs. And he makes a good point, right? Like, of course, it's easy to follow God when things are going well. So God says, all right, well, God gives him freedom to challenge Job, and that's exactly what happens. Job basically loses everything. He loses all his riches. He loses his children. I'm summarizing here, and he's put through great difficulty, great pain, and even he gets sores all over his body. Pretty much, other than his wife, he loses everything. And even his wife says, just curse God and die. Like, just go ahead, throw in the towel. God has done you wrong, and, have done with it. And Job has friends that come along, so that's his counsel of his wife. His good buddies come and join him and comfort him and sit with him in the ashes because he's just sitting in the ashes, scraping his sores with shards of pottery. And his friends come and they start questioning him. They say, what have you done wrong? Obviously, if God's punishing you, you've done something wrong. And they question him, and they don't get it. Job certainly doesn't get it. His wife doesn't get it. Job is alone. He's alone, and that's the challenge he's in. What will Job do? What would I do? What would you do in a situation where you had all the things that you love, all the things that were important to you, taken away from you? You will feel like that. Okay, it's not a matter of if. You will feel like that at times. You'll feel like you just want to curse God and die, and because of hardships. The long or the short is Job does cry out to God, and that is okay to do. We see it in the book of Psalms. He cries out to God, God, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this to me? What have I done to deserve this? In anguish. And he doesn't reject God. Okay, he doesn't curse God. He, out of his emotion, he cries out to God, and that is okay to do. To feel the feeling of discouragement and pain, and even to cry out to God. That's okay. What's not okay is to blame God or to reject God. And so he doesn't do that. He does cry out to God. And God answers him, and God says, who are you? Okay? Who are you, Job, to know my mind and my heart. And that's important for us to remember. God loves us, but he is still God. He is not safe. He is good, but he is not safe. He has his own way of doing things. And if the Lord wants to give and bless, he can do that. If he wants to take away, he can do that. We don't always know what he's doing. We don't know why he's doing it. Our job is to follow and to trust in good times and in hard times. And that's not easy. But that's what we're called to do, to know that he is God. And God says, where were you, Job, when I created the earth? Where were you, Job, when I created all the animals and all these things? In other words, nowhere. Right? Job doesn't know. God's putting Job in his place. But Job turns to God and receives that. And God blesses Job even more in the latter part of his life than in the former. God doubles all that, or even maybe even triples, I don't remember, but God blesses Job even more. So the lesson from Job is trust in hard times. Okay, God's got a plan even through the hard times. Okay, that's Job. Next, I want to go to Ezra. Okay, Ezra's an interesting character. I love Ezra. All right, not many people know about Ezra, but Ezra, I love Ezra. Ezra was a priest, prophet, and he had a vision from God. He had a vision to rebuild the temple. Okay, so what's happened is Israel's been obliterated, basically taken over by the Persians under the leader Cyrus, who we'll get to in a little bit. And they are taken captivity, removed from the land. They're spread out throughout, wherever. And Israel doesn't exist. But at one point, Ezra goes, and Cyrus, I think it's Cyrus allows Ezra to lead the Israelites to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Right? He's a Persian king, and for some reason, God used Cyrus to allow Ezra to lead the people back to rebuild the temple. And that's important. Why? Because this temple was at the very core of who their identity was. It was the core of who they were. To worship God is what they were called to do. And they couldn't do it because they didn't have the temple. The temple was the very centerpiece of their existence. And once that had been removed, that was hard. So Ezra goes and leads the people back, and they go and they begin to gather, and they're rejoicing. They begin to gather the people who are talented and gifted, the builders, and they begin to do the work of rebuilding the temple. And they build the foundation, and it talks about them celebrating, right? Ezra, they just celebrate, and they're all shouting and rejoicing because they've got the foundation to their identity back in place. And that's Ezra. Ezra leads that. Now, what's interesting, here's the thing. It starts out awesome, and it's exciting, and God is using Ezra. But something happens. Some of the people around the temple, some of the other nations, the small tribes, I guess you could say, they're not happy with that. They're not happy, and they want to put a stop to that because they're fearful that if Israel gets its identity back and its strength, that they'll start to make a fuss. They'll start to be a problem. So a group of them go to the king, okay, and they say, this is what's going on. I think Cyrus is long gone by this time. I think they have another king, Zerubbabel maybe. And they go to the king, and or I think it's before Zerubbabel. But anyway, they go to the king and they say, if you let the Israelites do this, they're just going to cause problems. That's the history. And the king says, okay, stop. And he makes an edict and he says, no more building. Okay, so now that they've gotten excited, they're all excited about it. Well, now they got another king who's a bad king, and he says no. He puts a halt to it, and that goes on for a long time. And that's the challenge is for Ezra and his people, that God gives them a vision, God gives them something that seems really good, and then all of a sudden, boop, stop. Okay, and I love to say at this point that God steps in immediately and like changes the heart of the king, or that he protects the people and everything changes. Like God could snap his finger and send a horde of angels down to rebuild the temple like that. I mean, God could do these things, but he doesn't. Why? We don't know. We don't know why. And that's the why that. But what we do know, what we learned with Job, is that God has his own way of doing things in his own time for his own glory. And so also with Ezra and the people, they were very sad. If I was Ezra, I would have been impatient. I would have been angry, frustrated, sad. I would have been throwing in the towel and say, I quit. God, you led me out here to do all this, and now you're not even helping me out. But that's just not right. We need to trust God to day by day by day. If he gives us something to do, to pursue it and not give up until he makes clear to change otherwise. And to keep with that, and to know that God's timing is not our timing, okay? To know that sometimes God is working on his own time. So again, patience in God's time. Okay? Ezra, patience in God's time. And I will tell you, the good news is that, sorry, that was my shoe, I promise. The good news is that God does let them rebuild the temple. They do rebuild the temple. They worship God. They celebrate, and they run into some new challenges, new problems, which is that the people immediately start disobeying God and worshiping other things. And Ezra has to do some hard things to call the people back to worship, because just like before, they keep running away from God. So anyway, that's Ezra. And then we get to Nehemiah. Okay? Nehemiah. And Nehemiah, similar to Ezra, very similar story. Nehemiah was in Persia serving Cyrus, and he was a cupbearer to the king, right? Cupbearer. He had a lowly task, but he had access to the king. And he actually, his job was to test the drink that the king would drink to make sure it wasn't poisonous. All right, that was his job. And he would go and test. So he had a low position. He was just a guy that could die for the sake of the king. And he went to the king, and he felt like God had called him to. He had a passion for his people. And, Artaxerxes. I think that's who it was. Artaxerxes. Yeah, Artaxerxes. And he went to Artaxerxes because he believed in the idea of Jerusalem being restored. Okay? So not just the temple, but the walls of Jerusalem, so that they could have their own place. So the temple in the middle, Jerusalem was the town that surrounded it, and if they could have a wall, then they would be protected, and then they would be free to be their own people. And so he went to the king and asked him if they could rebuild the walls. And the king said yes, absolutely. The king did let him do it. Not only that, but he gave him resources to do it. He gave him resources and supplies to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. I mean, miraculous, right? And that's what they did, and it was glorious. However, they had challenges. The reason they had challenges was because there were still outside people that did not want them, the outside nations, the evil nations, did not want them to rebuild their walls. And so it describes how they had to work with a sword in one hand and a hammer in the other, right? When they were working on the wall, they'd have to turn and fight, and then go back to the wall and work on the wall. And it was this constant process of doing this, and it was very hard, very difficult, but they got the walls rebuilt. Nehemiah was a lowly man, young man, who had to have courage to go to the king to ask for a hard thing, and God honored that, and the walls were rebuilt. So you got Nehemiah, and Nehemiah had to learn to have courage to trust God. Courage to trust God. And to follow God. And all the people that followed Nehemiah had to have courage, knowing that what God had given them, the vision, was going to be costly. Okay, and there were lives. They were in battle, so there were lives that would have been lost. And that's what God wants for us. He wants us to have courage when He calls us to do something, because it's not going to be easy, but to have patience that will happen in his time. And when challenges come, that we have to trust that God is still with us, that he is the boss. He's in control. He's good. So that's them. Then we get to one of my favorite characters in the Bible, and that's Esther. All right, Esther. So Esther, could say a lot about Esther. Esther was an orphan girl, and she was beautiful. And there was a king who had many wives, but his wives didn't satisfy him, and so he went in search. His people went and the people that worked for him went to get him a beautiful wife, and they got Esther, and she was Jewish. Okay, and let's see, Esther was she went to be with the king, and I mean, long story short, it was an evil king. And he had some evil advisors. And Esther had an uncle who was a good uncle. And his name is Mordecai. And Mordecai was honored by the king, but he was hated by some of the king's advisors. Esther, meantime, she's not a queen at this point. She's one of many women that the king had to please himself. That was her position. I mean, that was it. She was just, for the king's pleasure. One of many women. And she was, had no real significance. That was her lot in life. Taken to be the king's pleasure. And, but the king had a plan, or the evil advisors had a plan to have all the Jewish people destroyed and killed. So they tricked the king into a situation where he was going to kill all the Jews. Okay, he was going to kill them all. Mordecai went to Esther, his niece, who was in this hard position, and he said, "Listen, you need to go to the king, and you need to convince him that this is not right and this is a trick. You need to convince him otherwise." And Esther, she just said, "No, I don't want to do that." She didn't want to do this because she knew, first of all, that if the king wasn't pleased with her, that she could be killed. She was being self-protective. She said, if I go to the king and he doesn't want me there, or if he feels like I'm being unfair, and he's a irrational king, that it would be the end of me. I would lose my life. What good would that be? And but Mordecai pushes on her and says, "Listen, you have to do this. This is why you're here, for such a time as this. You have been placed in this position, even though it's a hard position, and you didn't ask for it, a terrible position. That's the position that God has put you in, possibly to save the entire nation. It rests on you, Esther. You have to do this." So Esther, I love this. She's very wily. She's very strategic. So she believes and trusts against her will. She isn't really excited about it, but she knows she has to do this. So she gets a plan, and her plan is to throw the king a feast. I think it's even a couple feasts. She basically wines and dines the king and gains his pleasure, gains his affirmation. And then she goes to the king. And at that very point, she realizes that this could be the last thing that she does in her life. But she goes to the king and she says, "King, I want to ask you if you would do me a big favor." And he says, "Yeah, what is it? Even if up to, whatever, or even to my kingdom, I would do for you." So she's gained his pleasure. And then she says, there is a plot to destroy all my people. And then he's like, wow, he didn't know, because she hid that she was a Jew. She hid it. She pretended that she wasn't. And I'm not saying that's right, but what I am saying is that once he realized that, the king had a change of heart. And instead of destroying all the Jews, he had his own evil advisors killed. And Mordecai, who was Esther's uncle, was exonerated or he was honored. But the moral of the story here, or the point of the story, is that God used Esther. God used Esther, little, unimportant Esther, and she became a queen in her position of weakness to save his people. So God used her weakness. Weakness is used by God. Okay. Weakness is used by God. God used Esther, and she was courageous. She had courage. She didn't want to, but she realized what she had to do. And God used her position and also her strategy. God used strategy to do the right thing to save his people. So, we got these four characters. I got one more to talk about. His name is Cyrus. And I'll just say this, make it personal here. One of the things that challenged me most when I went off to college, okay, one of the times when I really was very close to questioning my faith and really questioning God, because I went to college and I began to meet people that were not Christian, and I had this idea that people that weren't Christian were bad people, and they were, they didn't get it, and they didn't, and and what I realized was we're all bad people. And I actually went to college, and I actually became friends with some people that were not Christian, that were other religions or atheists, and they were good people. I mean, honestly, some of them were better behaved, more kind than some other Christians I knew. Some of them were more moral than me at that time, and I began to say, you know what, in the world, like, I guess, how could Christianity be real when I see these people that seem so kind and loving and good? And then at the same time, I began to see in the lives of some of my Christian friends, including myself, that we were sinners and that we could be very unkind. So that caused me to really wrestle with my faith and question this whole thing of Christianity. And I had to figure that out because if I was going to be a pastor, which I was considering, I had to reconcile that, and that was tough. And then came Cyrus. And in the Old Testament, it talks about Cyrus, and it says in the book of Isaiah that he was chosen by God. He was anointed by God to be used by God, and God used him to do some amazing things. And yet he didn't even believe in God. He wasn't a Jew. He wasn't Israel. He didn't believe. He believed in many gods. He worshipped many gods. And what that told me was this, that in this world, there are many people who don't believe in God, and yet God still uses them and even uses them for his good and can use the good that they do. Okay? There are plenty of people in the world who are not Christian. They may be Muslim, they may be Buddhist, they may be Hindu, they may be atheist, and they do good things. They do kind things. They're thoughtful, they're smart, they're brilliant, they're talented. And at the same time, there are Christians out there, people who claim to be Christians and probably still truly are, who can be evil, or do evil things, I should say. That's not what makes somebody a follower of Jesus. Okay? How good they are, how smart they are, how nice they are, what amazing things they do, right, is not what makes them a Christian. And we need to realize that Cyrus was not a Christian, but God used him to do an amazing thing. And there are plenty of people out there who will do amazing things that you'll really like and love, and maybe even some of you will fall in love with somebody who is really great. And it will be tempting to think, maybe this is okay, I don't understand. But let me tell you, it's not how good you are that makes you a Christian. Okay? It's the fact that you believe and trust that Jesus died for your sins. And at the same time, Christians do dumb things and cannot always be perfect. But that doesn't mean they're not a Christian. It just means we all need God's grace. We all need God's grace. So consider these 5 people. Cyrus You know, all these 5 people were in this time period of the temple, possibly except for Job. We don't know for sure. But during this second building of the temple, just remember that God is continuing to do his work. He's continuing to be faithful to the thing that he's committed to, and that's the preservation of his people, the church, into the New Testament. And what is the point of the temple? It exists for his glory. That God is using all these things for his own glory. And he uses interesting personalities and the mistakes, and I could go into the mistakes of a lot of Old Testament characters. He uses them, he uses their mistakes, he uses their successes. He's teaching them to have courage, even in their weakness, to be patient and to trust him in hard times. And those are lessons that we need to be learning. But at the very bottom, the very basic point of it is that he's accomplishing his glory. And it's all pointing towards his worship, which is the cross. Now, Israel, over and over and over and again, they don't get it. They wander away from him. They come back to him. They wander away from him. They come back to him. And God is faithful to hold them. And he's leading them to something that is even more glorious. Okay? Even more glorious than the temple. And it's the person of Jesus Christ. All of the Old Testament points, like fingers, pointing all the stories, all the characters, Ezra, Job, Abraham, Moses, Joshua, Nehemiah, Ruth, all these stories point, like fingers, pointing to the cross of Jesus Christ. That's where we're headed. So just keep that in mind, and I'll stop right there. Wish I could have, if you guys have questions, you can email me, but I love you and miss you. And get your project done, your casket timeline, and your other homework assignments. And I will talk to you guys soon. All right, bye.